All right, welcome to the Church Dropout podcast. My name is Alan. I am the host. Church Dropout is a podcast where we talk about issues, topics, and teachings related to faith, life, and culture in ways that are sometimes funny, sometimes serious, but always insightful. I am joined by my co-host and lovely wife, Lisa.
Hello.
And if you have not already, please like, rate, and subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast at. We'd appreciate your support. Today I want to talk about some comments that were made about Martin Luther King Jr. during Black History Month by a prominent evangelical pastor, John MacArthur. Mm-hmm. And this was done during his Shepherd's Conference. Seems like the older John MacArthur gets, the more, grumpier he gets. And he has these outbursts about certain things that are going on within the culture. And one of the things that he spoke about was Martin Luther King's salvation. And apparently, Martin Luther King is in hell and that Martin Luther King is not saved. Now, he didn't say that, but that's the implications. If Martin Luther King is not a Christian, then Martin Luther King is damned. Right. And that's whatever you believe to be true about the doctrine of hell. Right. Okay. Right. So whether you believe in annihilation, whatever you believe in, Martin Luther King is not with Jesus. And so I don't want to really talk about the absurdity of the comment itself. I mean, we don't have the right to judge heaven or hell.
We sure don't.
Or to say somebody's a Christian or not. And
exactly.
There's many people who have, defended Martin Luther King's work over the years. And, he had some papers that he wrote as an undergrad and all kinds of stuff that, that may not have made him orthodox in his belief. There's people who have defended that, and I'm not even interested in talking about that and defending whether or not Martin Luther King was a Christian or not. I believe he was a Christian. But hey, that to me is besides the point.
Yes.
The main thing to me is what I think has been happening a long time in evangelicalism since a long time in white evangelical spaces since slavery, on throughout church history as it relates to American church history. And that is the weaponization of theology. How theology has been used as a weapon to, silence, condemn, disavow, disregard, diffuse, disillusion, disassociate people, movements, ideas that are different than the dominant culture's particular view and group. So there seems to be this pattern of using theology to separate, right? To say, hey, bad theology, we don't have to deal with that. We don't listen to that. We don't want anything to do with that. And I think it goes back to this idea of Christianity, especially when it comes to these particular spaces of the idea of being right versus doing right. We've talked about that before, I don't know why we think that Christianity is about being right, that God is celebrating us having right beliefs versus celebrating how those beliefs are actually being lived out
yes.
in reality, in the real world, right? It's one thing to believe the Trinity, but it's another thing to demonstrate the love of God unconditionally, effectually in the world, which affirms your belief, not the fact that you understand the Trinity. But there seems to be this idea that we can use theology as a weapon, or the reality is we use theology as a weapon to condemn people. You understand? Like as a badgering stick or a measuring stick. And this is just sad. You know what I mean?
Sad.
It's sad.
It's very sad. It's also upsetting because, for one, it's during Black History Month.
Yeah.
So,
which says a lot.
Yeah. And we all know, if you don't know, what Martin Luther King stood for,
Absolutely.
Jr., was about equality, about coming together, about breaking down those walls and not having there be division, but everybody together. And so why would you take this time where there's this month that has been set aside for celebration to talk negatively about one of the leaders that was uplifting that and was speaking about that. You know what I mean? So I just think that it was poor timing, but maybe in his eyes it was perfect timing.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? And that's a problem to me. That's a problem for somebody to feel like they need to bring up this topic or have this conversation that they know is gonna have a negative output.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
Are people going to say, oh my gosh, that was so amazing. I'm so glad that you said that about Martin Luther King. That just inspires me. That no, you know what I mean?
Well, the sad part is, yeah, some people did. And they are rooting for that. And that's,
But so I would look at it like, if people are rooting for that, what are their reasonings behind that? You know what I mean?
Yes.
Do you think that they're gonna go hug on their brother and sister that's of a opposite race or have a opposite belief in what was said? Are they gonna go hug on them and say, even is that gonna bring them together, or is that gonna bring them further apart?
I think you're hitting on what the issue is. Is what is meant to be accomplished by claiming or making a statement about the eternal rest of Martin Luther King Jr.,
who's not here to defend himself, to prove if I'm a Christian or I'm not a Christian.
Right. So what's the purpose? Like, why do we need to have this?
Right.
And again, I think that there is an obsession with being right versus doing right, to the point where we don't even use wisdom. That God is pleased with getting things right. Right. So here you have a man who demonstrated the love of God in a way that these guys have not even come close, to the point where his life was taken because of it.
Right.
And they're concerned about whether or not he lined up on every line of doctrine that matches their doctrine. And they're dismissing all of that because they may not feel like he does. Being right versus doing right.
Right.
Okay.
And we don't have the power to judge anybody.
Yeah.
We don't have that power. So why are we acting like we do?
Yeah. We don't judge people eternally.
Right.
Right. We don't. And people will stand behind things like saying, oh, you'll know them by their fruits. And, it depends on what fruit you're talking about. Okay. Because biblical fruit is not just portrayed in, well, actually, when we talk about biblical fruit, it's talking about love, peace, joy, patience, all of the things that were displayed in a person's life. Now, the reality is that there may have been some moral failings there. But again, that's still besides the point. So I'm not going to argue whether or not he is a Christian or he is not.
Right.
To me, the problem is this. This is why I think it's important. This is why I think they're talking about this and why they want to disavow this. One, I think people radically hold their beliefs in a way that they want to rule out any other viewpoint that doesn't line up with theirs. They really do believe that this is right.
Right.
They hold that tightly, and they use that, again, as a weapon to disavow anybody else's beliefs. But again, I think that's a distortion of Christianity. I think that's a distortion of proper theology.
Yeah.
The other part is that if Martin Luther King Jr. was correct, and if the things that he fought for and the ideas that he stood for are correct, that would mean that evangelicalism as a whole would have to change.
Yeah.
That it would actually condemn evangelicalism as a part of the problem, right? And so if we dismiss Martin Luther King, then we don't have to deal with what he taught. And see, and this is the problem, is that instead of looking at the contribution of evangelicalism, white evangelicalism, to race in America, to slavery down through the ages, instead of addressing the reality of the part that evangelicals played and the lack of action that evangelicals have played in that, it's much easier to say someone's theology disqualifies them than to engage where the issues are. And the fact that somebody would say this, to me, demonstrates, they would say this especially during Black History Month, shows that those same issues that were there long ago are still here today. it's still there.
Yeah.
It's the same mindset. It's the same attitude. It's the same thought process. Nothing has changed. And let me say this, just the last part on this. When we did the Black church video, some people were saying, well, we shouldn't have a Black church or a white church and this, that, and this. Well, one, this is a prime reason why there's a Black church. Okay.
Yep.
But let's not mistake that there is nothing called the white church today.
Right.
Evangelicalism is the white church.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
It's the white church. It is white culture. It is the white church. So when that hasn't always been historically, but when we say evangelicalism today, when you look at what it stands for, when you look at how it thinks through politics and how it thinks through social issues, it is the white church.
Right.
So just because there is no white church doesn't mean that there is no white church. Evangelicalism today is representative of white culture in the church. And this is the reason why there is other forms and expressions of church and why we're not unified because of things like this.
Right.
We use our theology to separate ourselves from communities and from people. We use our theology to silence people of color, to silence women in the church. We use our theology to do all of this stuff, right? That's extra biblical. That is not Christianity. That is only concerned with being right and not concerned with doing right. That it's not based on giving things up. It's based on keeping things close. It is not sacrificial love. That it's not the demonstration of sacrificial love that Christ exemplified in how he held his theology, right? In John 13, Jesus says, it says that before Jesus went to wash the disciples' feet, right? Before he goes and washes the disciples' feet, it says that he knew who he was. He knew who he came from. He came from the Father. He knew what his mission was. And out of that identity, he washes their feet. The reason why I'm bringing that up is because our truth should cause us to act in radical ways. Because we know who we are, we should be willing to cross lines and paths. Because of who we are. It shouldn't cause us to abstain or to pull away. And the reality is that the Christianity that these individuals are demonstrating is not Christianity. And for what it's worth, I don't want to be a part of that. That's not Christianity to me. And so, I think it's sad. I think it's a shame. I think it sends the wrong message. I think this is why a lot of people are walking away from the church. I think in part because there's a lot of people who aren't willing to stand up and say things about stuff like this because people are standing on the sideline and not wanting to burn relationships because of these things that people say, the worship of man, the fear of man, all of that type stuff. But the reality is that it was a horrible statement to say.
I agree.
It had racial undertones to me. It is not communicative of the gospel. It is not demonstrative of the gospel. It shouldn't have been said.
I agree.
Didn't need to be said. So anyway, I'll jump off my soapbox there. We'd love to hear your comments on this. Maybe you've heard, maybe you disagree, maybe you agree. But yeah, anyway, we'd love to hear your comments. And yeah, that's it for Church Dropout.
All right. Good night.
Good night.